The young girl was left for the vultures, abandoned in a place where hope seemed as distant as the horizon. The mountain man, a figure shrouded in mystery and wilderness, emerged from the shadows when all seemed lost. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The sky over Hollow Creek churned with black wings as dusk fell, the cries of vultures slicing through the tense silence. Their shadows danced across the barren ridge where Emily Johnson lay bound with thick ropes that cut into her wrists and ankles. Her thin frame trembled not just from the biting evening chill, but from the terror of knowing what awaited her. The young girl's eyes, wide with fear yet somehow still holding a flicker of defiance, searched the empty horizon for any sign of mercy. Below the ridge, villagers gathered in a solemn half-circle, their faces masks. Her eyes darted between Emily and Margaret, conflict written across her features. She had treated the girl's fevers last winter, had seen her gentle spirit. Yet fear of exile kept her rooted in place, silent when her conscience screamed for her to speak. The vultures descended lower, their patience wearing thin as the last crimson streaks of sunlight bled from the sky. One particularly bold bird swooped close to Emily, causing her to cry out, a sound that echoed across the valley like a broken prayer. Then came another sound, the thunder of hooves pounding against earth, growing louder with each passing second. Heads turned toward the high slopes where a lone rider appeared, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Michael Smith, the mountain man known for his solitary ways, charged down the treacherous path, his horse navigating the dangerous terrain with practiced ease. The villagers collectively gasped as he approached. Michael's normally stoic face was transformed by determination, his jaw set and eyes blazing with resolve. His broad shoulders, strengthened by years of survival in the wilderness, were tensed as he drove his mount forward with single-minded purpose. "He wouldn't dare," Robert Martin muttered, the blacksmith's massive hands clenching into fists at his sides. "No one interferes with the right." But interfere he did. As Michael dismounted in one fluid motion, his worn leather boots hitting the ground with finality, the collective intake of breath from the villagers was audible. They knew what this meant. The mountain man was about to defy a tradition older than memory itself, and nothing in Hollow Creek would ever be the same again. Michael Smith's knife flashed in the dying light, the blade catching the last crimson rays of sunset as he severed Emily Johnson's bonds. The rough hemp fell away from her raw wrists and ankles, releasing her from what would have been a death sentence. Above them, the vultures scattered in a chaotic storm of black feathers, their shrill cries piercing the dusk as they circled higher, temporarily denied their feast. The mountain man moved with practiced efficiency, his weathered hands gentle despite their strength. Emily trembled uncontrollably, too weak to stand on her own after hours exposed on the ridge. Without hesitation, Michael swept her onto his horse, his muscles straining as he lifted her frail body. The girl weighed almost nothing in his arms, dehydration and fear having taken their toll. "Hold tight," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He mounted behind her, one arm securing her against his chest while the other gripped the reins. Several vultures, bolder than the rest, swooped low, beaks and talons snapping at the air around them. Michael hunched protectively over Emily, shielding her from the aggressive birds as they made their retreat. From the edge of the ridge, a wave of outrage rose from the gathered villagers. Their voices trembled with fear and generations of superstition, faces contorted with a mixture of anger and terror. "You've doomed us all." Elder Margaret Brown's authoritative voice cut through the chaos, her finger pointing accusingly at Michael. "The sacrifice must be completed. The spirits demand it." Robert Martin pushed to the front of the crowd, his blacksmith's frame imposing even at a distance. "Smith, bring her back or don't return to Hollow Creek yourself," he bellowed, his jealousy finding purpose in tradition. The villagers' cries grew more frantic. Some fell to their knees, already praying for forgiveness from whatever ancient powers they believed watched over their small community. Others grabbed stones, though none dared approach the mountain man and his mount. "The crops will wither, the streams will dry," someone shouted from the back. Michael ignored them all. His focus remained solely on the girl's shallow, panicked breaths against his chest, each one a small victory. Emily's eyes were half closed, consciousness slipping away as shock took hold. He could feel her heart racing beneath his protective arm. "Stay with me," he whispered, urging his horse forward along the treacherous mountain path. Behind them, the voices faded as distance grew. But Michael knew the consequences of his actions would follow them both. For now, all that mattered was getting the girl to safety, away from the vultures that still circled overhead and the human predators below who had bound her in the name of tradition. Michael Smith urged his horse forward through the darkness, its hooves finding purchase on the narrow mountain paths he traversed countless times before. The animal snorted with exertion as they climbed higher, away from Hollow Creek and the angry voices that faded into the night. Emily Johnson clung desperately to his back, her thin arms wrapped around his waist with surprising strength for someone who had been left to die. "We're almost there," he murmured, feeling her violent trembling against him. The mountain man wasn't sure if it was the biting cold or the memory of being bound on that barren ridge that made her shake so. Perhaps both. The vulture's cries still echoed in his mind, and he could only imagine how they haunted the girl. When his cabin finally appeared through the trees, a dark silhouette against the starlit sky, Michael felt Emily's grip tighten momentarily before relaxing. He dismounted first, then gently lifted her down. Her legs buckled beneath her, and he caught her weight easily, carrying her across the threshold of the only home he'd known for years. Inside, he laid her carefully on his bed of furs and pine boughs, then moved to light the oil lamp and stoke the dying embers in the hearth. As warmth gradually filled the small space, Emily's eyes darted around, taking in the sparse furnishings and the walls adorned with dried herbs and hunting tools. "You're safe here," Michael said, his voice rough from disuse. Living alone on the mountain had made conversation a forgotten luxury. He pulled several thick blankets from a wooden chest and wrapped them around her shoulders. "No one from the village will come this high." The girl nodded, but remained silent, watching as he gathered supplies to tend her wounds. The ropes had cut deeply into her wrists and ankles, leaving angry red welts that would likely scar. With gentle movements that belied his large, calloused hands, he cleaned each abrasion with water and herbs, then applied a salve Anna Davis had once taught him to make. Emily winced, but didn't cry out. "Why did you save me?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. The mountain man paused, weathered face revealing nothing of the turmoil within. "Because no one deserves to die for another's fear," he answered simply. He offered her a wooden cup of water, which she accepted with trembling hands. As she drank, Michael moved to the window, looking out toward the village below. What he'd done would not be forgiven easily. Elder Margaret would ensure that. But watching Emily's reflection in the glass as she huddled beneath his blankets, he knew he would make the same choice again. His silent presence spoke volumes, a wordless vow that unlike the villagers who had turned away, he would not abandon her to face the darkness alone. The council hall echoed with the sharp, commanding voice of Elder Margaret Brown. Her weathered hands gripped the ancient oak podium as she addressed the gathered villagers of Hollow Creek, her eyes flashing with righteous indignation. "Michael Smith has violated our most sacred tradition," Margaret declared, her voice carrying to the rafters where shadows danced in the firelight. "The girl was chosen by the elders as this season's offering. The mountain spirits demand their due, and he has robbed them of their sacrifice." The villagers murmured anxiously, exchanging worried glances. For generations, their community had survived through strict adherence to the old ways. The elder's words stirred deep-seated fears of drought, disease, and starvation, punishments they believed would surely follow such defiance. The vultures were already gathering, Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. They are the messengers of the Ancient Ones. When they are denied, the land itself will turn against us. Our crops will wither, our children will sicken, our animals will die. In the back of the hall, Anna Davis clutched her medicine pouch tightly, her knuckles white with tension. The village healer had known Emily Johnson since birth, had treated her childhood fevers and bound her scraped knees. The memory of the girl's terrified face as they had dragged her to the ridge haunted Anna's dreams. "We must demand the mountain man return Emily immediately," the elder insisted, pounding her fist on the podium. "Before the first planting, before the spirits unleash their fury upon us all." Shouts of agreement rose from the crowd. Fear was a powerful force in Hollow Creek, and Margaret knew precisely how to wield it. Anna's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to remind them that Emily was just a child, innocent and undeserving of such a fate. But the healer remembered all too well what had happened to the last villager who had questioned the rite of atonement. Banishment into the wilderness was tantamount to a death sentence. "Anyone who aids the outsider will share in his punishment," Margaret warned, her gaze sweeping across the gathering until it settled briefly on Anna. The healer lowered her eyes, shame burning in her chest. As the meeting dispersed, villagers huddled in small groups, their voices hushed but urgent. The elder's warnings had taken root, feeding the collective dread that had always kept Hollow Creek bound to tradition. Anna slipped away quietly, her heart heavy with cowardice. In her small hut filled with drying herbs and healing potions, she stared at her reflection in a bowl of water. The face that looked back seemed suddenly like that of a stranger, someone who had chosen safety over what was right. Spring brought renewal to Hollow Creek. With controlled fires clearing the winter-dead fields, smoke spiraled into the dawn sky as villagers prepared the earth for planting. But while the land awakened with fresh promise, the community remained deeply divided. Around the council bonfires, tempers flared hotter than the flames themselves. Margaret Brown stood firm, her weathered face set in determination as she addressed the gathered villagers. "The girl must be returned to the ridge," she declared, her voice carrying across the square. "Our ancestors demand balance. Michael Smith has disrupted the natural order." Robert Martin nodded vigorously beside her. His blacksmith's arms crossed over his broad chest. "The mountain man thinks himself above our ways," he growled. "Who will protect us when the spirits turn against us?" Yet not everyone agreed. Anna Davis stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, her healer's hands fidgeting with her shawl. She said nothing, but her eyes revealed her inner conflict. Among the younger villagers, whispers circulated that perhaps Michael's defiance was not a curse, but a blessing, a sign that times were changing, that mercy might prove stronger than tradition. Meanwhile, high in the mountains, Emily Johnson was experiencing a different kind of renewal. Michael taught her to ride his sturdy mount, his calloused hands steady on her back as she learned to balance. At first, she flinched at his touch, memories of the ridge still fresh in her mind. But his patience never wavered. "Grip with your knees," he instructed, his voice gentler than anyone in the village had ever heard it. "The horse responds to your confidence." Day by day, Emily grew stronger. Michael showed her how to set snares for rabbits, how to identify edible plants, how to move silently through the forest. His patient instruction filled the cabin that had known only silence for so many years. One evening, as they prepared a meal from their day's hunting, Emily dropped a pan with a clatter. She froze, expecting anger. Instead, Michael chuckled, the rusty sound as if long unused. "I did worse my first time cooking alone," he admitted. Emily's laughter burst forth unexpectedly, surprising them both. It echoed through the cabin walls, bright and clear as spring water. The mountain man smiled, the lines around his eyes softening. In that moment, something shifted. The cabin, once merely a refuge from death, began to feel like something more. As wildflowers pushed through the mountain soil outside, Emily's spirit likewise began to mend, tentative hope taking root where only fear had grown before. Word of Emily Johnson's survival had begun to spread among the children of Hollow Creek. They whispered stories of the girl who had faced the vultures and lived, saved by the mysterious mountain man who defied the elders. Their curiosity, untainted by years of superstition, drew them toward Michael's cabin like moths to flame. It started with 3 of the bolder ones, sneaking away during chore time, climbing the winding path that led to the mountain refuge. They hid behind pine trees, watching as Emily hung laundry outside the cabin, her movements still cautious, but growing stronger each day. When she spotted them, they froze, unsure whether to run or stay. "You can come closer," she called, her voice gentle. "I don't bite." The children approached warily, asking questions about the vultures, about what it felt like to be bound on the ridge. Emily answered honestly but kindly, careful not to frighten them. When they left, they carried back tales that contradicted everything they'd been told, that she wasn't cursed, that she could laugh and tell stories just like them. The next day, 5 children came, then 7. Soon, a small group would gather daily in the clearing near Michael's home. He watched from a distance, a hint of a smile softening his weathered face as Emily taught them to identify edible berries or showed them how to weave simple bracelets from grass. "Why do the grown-ups hate you?" one little girl asked Emily one afternoon. "They don't hate me," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "They're afraid of changing what they've always believed." These innocent friendships began healing something in Emily that bandages couldn't touch. The children's acceptance, their lack of judgment, restored pieces of her that had been shattered on that ridge. Down in the village, Robert Martin slammed his hammer against the anvil, each strike punctuating his growing resentment. The blacksmith had always seen himself as Hollow Creek's protector, the strongest man, the one who forged tools and weapons, who kept everyone safe. Now the children spoke of Michael Smith with awe in their voices. "Did you know he fought off 3 vultures with just his hands?" he overheard a boy saying in the square. Robert's knuckles whitened around his hammer. For years, he had been the one villagers turned to when something needed fixing, when strength was required. Now this outsider, this mountain-dwelling hermit, had stolen that respect with one impulsive act. "The children shouldn't be going up there," he muttered to whoever would listen. "It's not safe. The girl is marked. Smith is defying our ways." But even as he spoke, another group of children slipped away toward the mountain path, drawn by the promise of stories and the company of the girl who had survived the impossible. Summer descended upon Hollow Creek in a riot of color as the annual weaving fair transformed the village square. Women proudly displayed intricate textiles dyed with vibrant mountain herbs, their fingers still stained with indigo and saffron. Children darted between stalls, while elders examined the craftsmanship with critical eyes. The air hummed with conversation, but beneath the festive atmosphere ran an undercurrent of tension. Emily Johnson wandered through the fair with cautious wonder, her eyes wide as she took in the spectacle. Michael Smith stood nearby, his tall frame easily visible among the crowd. Though he rarely attended village gatherings, he had agreed to accompany the girl, knowing how much she longed to see the celebration. "She doesn't belong here," whispered a villager, quickly averting her gaze when Michael glanced in her direction. The blacksmith had been watching them since their arrival. Robert Martin's muscular frame pushed through the crowd with deliberate force, his face flushed with purpose. He had been waiting for this moment, a public confrontation where the entire village would witness his challenge. "Smith," Robert called out, his voice cutting through the market chatter. The crowd fell silent, conversations dying mid-sentence as villagers turned to watch. "You've defied our oldest traditions. That girl was chosen for the ridge. She belongs to the vultures, not to you." Michael positioned himself between Emily and the blacksmith, his weathered face betraying no emotion. "No person belongs to another," he replied, his voice quiet yet carrying across the hushed gathering. "And no tradition is worth an innocent life." Robert stepped closer, jabbing a finger toward Emily. "Elder Margaret says the spirits are angry. The crops are already suffering. Will you sacrifice all of Hollow Creek for one girl?" Anna Davis stood at the edge of the crowd, her healer's bag clutched tightly against her chest. She wanted to speak up, but remained frozen, torn between her duty to the village and what she knew was right. "I won't return her to die," Michael stated, his words carrying the weight of mountains. "If your spirits demand the blood of children, perhaps they're not worth worshipping." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some villagers nodded in quiet agreement, while others muttered prayers to ward off blasphemy. The division was palpable, like a crack forming in ancient stone. Robert's face darkened with rage. "You'll regret this, mountain man. When hunger comes, remember it was your doing." As the blacksmith stormed away, the fair resumed, but the mood had shifted. Laughter seemed forced, conversations muted. Emily slipped her hand into Michael's, her small gesture of gratitude visible to all who watched. The confrontation had done more than disrupt the festivities. It had forced every villager to choose a side in a conflict that would only grow more bitter as summer waned. Thunder rumbled across the jagged peaks, its deep growl echoing through the valley as dark clouds gathered above Hollow Creek. Inside his cabin, Michael Smith secured the shutters against the approaching storm, while Emily watched from beside the hearth, the dancing flames casting shadows across her face. "Best get some sleep," Michael said, his voice barely audible above the wind that howled through the mountain pines. "Storm's gonna be a bad one." They were halfway through their evening meal when the mountain itself seemed to groan. The ground trembled beneath them. Dishes rattling on the wooden table. Michael leapt to his feet, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her toward the door just as a deafening crash shook the cabin. "Rock slide!" he shouted, pushing her ahead of him. They stumbled outside into the rain, but Michael turned back, realizing something had been left behind. That moment of hesitation cost him dearly. A massive boulder crashed down the slope, followed by a cascade of rocks and debris. Emily screamed as the mountain man disappeared beneath a shower of stone and earth. When the rumbling stopped, she frantically clawed through the rubble. Michael lay pinned beneath a fallen tree, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. With strength born of desperation, Emily managed to free him and somehow drag his unconscious form back into the cabin. Through the night, she tended to his wounds, cleaning the deep cuts with water and herbs Anna had taught her to recognize. Her hands trembled, but remained steady enough to bind his injuries with torn strips of cloth. The mountain man's breathing was shallow, his skin burning with fever. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. By morning, Michael's fever broke. His eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition as he saw Emily slumped in exhaustion beside him. "You saved me," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Over the following days, as he lay recovering, the stoic facade that had defined him began to crack. During long evenings lit only by firelight, Michael spoke of his mother, a woman who had once stood alone against the village elders. She refused to accept their judgment, he told Emily, pain etching lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. Said no tradition was worth an innocent life. Emily listened, realization dawning in her eyes. What happened to her? Michael turned his face away. They drove her out. I was just a boy. In that moment, Emily understood why he had risked everything to save her from the ridge. Their stories were intertwined by more than chance, bound together by defiance against cruelty disguised as tradition. "We're alike, you and I," she said softly, taking his calloused hand in hers. "Survivors. Word of Michael Smith's injury sped through Hollow Creek like wildfire. By midday, every villager had heard how the mountain man lay broken after the rock slide. Many nodded knowingly, muttering that the mountains themselves had passed judgment on his defiance. In the council hall, Elder Margaret Brown stood before the anxious crowd, her voice carrying to the rafters. "The spirits have spoken. The man who defied our ways has been struck down." She pointed toward the withering corn stalks in the nearby fields. "Look at our crops. They fail because the girl still lives among us. The balance is broken." Panic rippled through the gathering. Farmers examined their yellowing plants with growing dread. Children whispered about angry mountain spirits. Even those who had questioned the old ways now exchanged worried glances. "The rite of atonement has protected our village for generations," Margaret continued, her weathered hands gripping her walking stick. "Without it, we face starvation and worse." That evening, as twilight settled over the valley, Anna Davis slipped away from the village. The healer followed the winding path to Michael's cabin, a small bundle of medicinal herbs clutched to her chest. She found Emily tending to Michael, changing the poultice on his bruised ribs. "I brought stronger medicine," Anna whispered, her eyes downcast. "It will help with the pain." Emily accepted the offering with a cautious nod. The two women worked in silence until Michael drifted into uneasy sleep. "I should have spoken up," Anna finally confessed, her voice breaking. "Before they took you to the ridge, I knew it was wrong." Emily stiffened. "Then why didn't you?" Margaret threatened to exile anyone who interfered. The healer's hands trembled. "She said my children would suffer if I opposed the ritual. I was a coward." Tears streamed down Anna's face as she revealed how Margaret had twisted the ancient stories, using fear to maintain her influence. The rite wasn't always about sacrifice. Something changed in the telling. Emily's expression softened. "You're here now. That's what matters." By candlelight, the women pored over Anna's grandmother's journal, discovering fragments of the original ceremony, a celebration of renewal, not death. The Vultures had once been revered as purifiers, not harbingers of doom. "We need to show them the truth," Emily said, determination hardening her voice. "Break the cycle of fear." Anna nodded, finally finding her courage. "Together, then, for all the girls who came before you." Outside, the wind carried their whispered pact across the valley, while in the village below, crops continued to wither under a cloudless sky. The first frost painted the ground white as Hollow Creek prepared for the autumn hunt ceremony. Villagers gathered in the square, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. The men returned from their hunting expedition, faces drawn with concern as they displayed their meager catch, a few thin rabbits and one small deer, hardly enough to sustain the village through the coming winter. Emily Johnson watched from the edge of the gathering, her slender frame wrapped in a woolen shawl. She felt the weight of suspicious glances as hunters laid their offerings before the ceremonial fire. Whispers traveled through the crowd like a cold wind. The animals were fewer than anyone could remember, and many blamed her presence for the scarcity. Margaret Brown stepped forward, her authoritative voice cutting through the murmurs. "The mountains have spoken," she declared, gesturing toward the barren peaks. "Our ancestors demand balance. The girl who cheated death has upset the natural order." The elder's eyes narrowed as she pointed directly at Emily. "She must be banished beyond our borders if we hope to survive the winter." Several villagers nodded in agreement, fear etching lines into their weathered faces. A mother clutched her children closer, while others cast their eyes downward, unwilling to meet Emily's gaze, yet equally unwilling to defend her. "The signs are clear," Margaret continued, her voice rising. "Withered crops, vanishing game, all since Michael brought her back from the ridge." She turned to address the crowd. "We must choose between one life and the survival of all." Robert Martin, the blacksmith, stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow. "Margaret speaks wisdom," he announced, hammer still hanging from his belt. "The old ways protected us for generations. Who are we to question them now?" His eyes found Michael in the crowd, challenge evident in his stance. Anna Davis stood at the edge of the gathering, her healer's bag clutched tightly in her hands. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, conflict visible in her expression. The villagers turned as one toward Michael Smith, who stood tall despite the tension surrounding him. The mountain man's weathered face revealed nothing as he surveyed the desperate faces before him. Emily moved closer to him, her trust in his protection evident. "You've brought this upon us," Robert accused. "What say you now, mountain man? Will you doom us all for one girl?" The silence stretched thin as ice as the village held its collective breath. Children peered from behind their parents' legs, and even the wind seemed to pause. Hollow Creek stood divided, half clinging to tradition, half questioning centuries of belief, all looking to Michael for an answer that would determine not just Emily's fate, but the future of their community. Michael Smith stood at the edge of his cabin, surveying the snow-dusted peaks with a critical eye. The village's accusations had grown louder, but he would not surrender Emily Johnson to their fears. Instead, he made a bold decision. "We need to prove your worth to them," he told Emily, handing her a thick fur coat. "We'll bring back what they need most, food and medicine." Emily nodded, her thin frame now stronger after months of recovery. The girl who once trembled at shadows now checked her knife with steady hands. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid morning air as they set off toward the highest ridges. The path grew treacherous as they climbed. Icy winds tore at their clothes, and loose stones threatened to send them tumbling into ravines. Michael moved with the confidence of someone who knew these mountains intimately, occasionally reaching back to guide Emily over particularly difficult passages. "My mother taught me these trails," he explained during a brief rest. "She knew where every healing herb grew, even in winter." Emily listened intently, recognizing the rare gift of Michael sharing his past. "Did she defy the village too?" she asked quietly. The mountain man nodded, his eyes distant. "She questioned what others accepted. It cost her dearly." They pushed onward, higher than Emily had ever ventured. Michael showed her how to identify wintergreen beneath the snow and where to find sheltered hollows where game might hide. When a sudden blizzard forced them to shelter in a narrow cave, Emily proved her growing skills by starting a fire with damp kindling. "You're a quick learner," Michael observed, genuine pride warming his voice. 3 days later, they returned to Hollow Creek, their packs heavy with herbs and several rabbits. The villagers gathered, murmuring in surprise at the bounty. Anna Davis approached first, examining the medicinal plants with obvious relief. "These will help with the winter coughs," the healer admitted, unable to hide her gratitude. Even Robert Martin, standing at the edge of the crowd, couldn't deny the value of their haul. The blacksmith's scowl deepened as he watched several elders accept Emily's offerings with reluctant thanks. That evening, as fires burned in village hearths, new conversations stirred. Margaret Brown tried to maintain her authority, insisting that temporary abundance didn't erase the need for tradition. But her words carried less weight now. "Perhaps we've been wrong," whispered one mother to another. "The girl brings life, not death." Emily caught these words as she helped distribute the herbs. For the first time since her rescue, she felt not just safe, but purposeful. Looking across at Michael's weathered face, she saw the same realization in his eyes. Together, they were changing more than just their own fates. The autumn feast brought a chill to Hollow Creek, tables laden with the season's harvest, as villagers gathered under a canopy of golden leaves. Robert Martin stood near the central fire, his blacksmith's frame casting a long shadow across the gathering. His eyes narrowed as Michael Smith arrived with Emily Johnson, the girl whose rescue had divided their community for months. "Time to settle this," Robert announced, his voice carrying across the feast grounds. A test of strength and skill, the old way. The blacksmith's challenge silenced the crowd, conversations dying as quickly as sparks in snow. Michael regarded him steadily. "I have no quarrel with you, Robert, but I have one with you," the blacksmith countered, flexing his hands. "You think you alone can protect her? That you know better than generations before us?" Elder Margaret Brown nodded approvingly from her seat of honor, while Anna Davis watched with worried eyes. The healer had seen too many injuries from such contests, and Michael was still recovering from the rock slide that had nearly claimed him months before. The challenge was simple yet brutal. 3 trials of village tradition, log splitting, stone lifting, and finally, hand-to-hand combat. Around them, the villagers formed a circle, their breath visible in the crisp air. In the first trial, Robert's axe swung with practiced precision, splitting logs with thunderous cracks. Michael matched him, his movements economical despite the pain evident in his eyes. When they finished, both men stood amid piles of split wood, neither clearly victorious. The stone lifting came next. The blacksmith hoisted a massive boulder to his chest, veins bulging as he held it for a count of 30. Michael, his side still tender from his earlier injury, grimaced as he matched the feat, sweat beading on his forehead despite the autumn chill. "The final test," Robert declared, removing his outer garments. The 2 men circled each other on packed earth, the village watching in tense silence. Emily clutched her hands together, her knuckles white. What followed was not the quick victory Robert had imagined. Though the blacksmith landed heavy blows, Michael weathered them, his mountain-hardened endurance keeping him in the fight. When Michael finally pinned his opponent, it was with quiet determination rather than triumphant rage. The village exhaled collectively. Michael rose slowly, offering a hand to Robert, who refused it with a scowl. "You've won nothing," the blacksmith muttered, stalking away. That night, as Emily tended to Michael's fresh bruises, a small group of villagers approached his place at the feast. They offered him bread and meat, a simple gesture, but meaningful. They might not understand his defiance of tradition, but they recognized his courage. "They're beginning to see," Emily whispered. Michael nodded, wincing as he shifted. His victory had cost him dearly, leaving him more isolated from many, yet strangely respected by a few. The reluctant guardian of Hollow Creek had proven his worth, not through cruelty or dominance, but through resilience, the very quality he had recognized in Emily from the start. The first snow of winter dusted Hollow Creek, transforming the landscape into a pristine white canvas. Inside Michael Smith's cabin, Emily Johnson sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, sorting through the few possessions she had managed to salvage from the night of her intended sacrifice. Her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed against something hard, hidden within the frayed rope that had once bound her wrists. "What's this?" she whispered, carefully extracting a small wooden token. The carving was simple yet distinctive, a vulture with wings spread wide, but not in threat. Instead, the bird seemed protective, watchful. Michael glanced over from where he was mending a torn jacket. His eyes widened as he recognized the symbol. Without a word, he crossed the room and retrieved a small wooden box from beneath a loose floorboard. Inside lay an identical token, worn smooth from years of handling. "My mother's," he explained, his voice unusually soft. "She kept it until the day she died." Emily turned the matching talisman over in her palm. "What does it mean?" "The village elders claim the vulture brings death," Michael said, settling beside her. "But my mother believed differently. She said vultures don't cause death, they transform it, returning life to the earth." The realization washed over them both, like the chill wind outside. Their fates had been intertwined long before that fateful night on the ridge. Michael's mother had once stood against the same ritual, and now her son had completed what she began. "They tried to sacrifice her too, didn't they?" Emily asked. The mountain man nodded, his weathered face solemn. She escaped, but lived as an outcast. I was born in this cabin, far from village judgment. Meanwhile, at the edge of Hollow Creek, Thomas Lopez unpacked his wagon of trade goods, his mind occupied with schemes rather than honest commerce. The trader had heard whispers about the girl who defied death and the man who challenged tradition. Such a story would fetch a handsome price in distant towns. "The Vulture girl," he muttered to himself, arranging trinkets on his makeshift stall. People would pay good coin to glimpse such a marvel. Thomas formulated his plan carefully. He would approach Emily with promises of safety in a faraway city, then parade her through villages and towns as a living curiosity. Her legend would make him wealthy beyond measure. As darkness fell, the trader warmed his hands over a small fire, unaware that his intended prize was discovering her true power, not as a victim or spectacle, but as the inheritor of a legacy of defiance that had waited generations to be fulfilled. Emily Johnson pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the trading post, her heart pounding as she overheard Thomas Lopez's hushed conversation with a stranger. The traveling trader was negotiating a price for her. "The girl who survived the Vultures," he called her, "worth a fortune in the northern settlements." A cold fury replaced her initial fear. Emily had not survived months of terror and healing only to become someone else's commodity. She stepped around the corner, startling both men. "I'm not yours to sell, Thomas," she said, her voice low but unwavering. The trader's eyes widened, then narrowed calculatingly. "Just business, girl," Thomas replied with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "People everywhere want to see the miracle child. You could live comfortably, not hiding in these mountains." Emily stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his face. "I'm not a story for you to profit from. I'm not a curse, or a blessing, or a miracle. I'm just a person who wants to live." The stranger slipped away as Thomas's expression hardened. "You think you have choices? The village still wants you gone. The mountain man can't protect you forever." "That's for me to decide," Emily replied, surprising herself with her own conviction. "My life has value beyond your superstitions and schemes." When she returned to the cabin, Michael Smith was repairing a broken snare by the hearth. One look at her face told him something had happened. "Thomas plans to take me away," she explained, sinking onto a wooden stool. "Sell me like some curiosity to people who want to see the Vulture girl." Michael's hands stilled. The mountain man had grown leaner through the winter, but no less formidable. "He won't touch you," he said simply. "I told him as much myself," Emily replied, a hint of pride warming her voice. A rare smile crossed Michael's weathered face. "You've changed since summer." "Because of you," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, because of who you always were." That evening, as snow began to fall outside, Michael stoked the fire and made a solemn promise. "I'll stand with you against Thomas, against the village, against anyone who threatens your freedom, even if I stand alone." Emily watched the flames dance, reflecting on how their fates had become intertwined. The bond between them, forged through months of hardship and healing, had grown into something neither could have imagined that first desperate night on the ridge. Outside, winter deepened its hold on Hollow Creek, but within the cabin, their shared courage burned like a beacon, illuminating a path forward through the darkness that still surrounded them. The winter lantern walk cast eerie shadows across Hollow Creek as villagers gathered along the frozen waterway. Frost crunched beneath their boots, while their breath formed misty clouds in the bitter cold. Margaret Brown stood at the head of the procession, her weathered face illuminated by the lantern she held high. The elder's eyes reflected determination as she prepared to reclaim the old ways that had governed their lives for generations. "Tonight, we restore balance," Margaret announced, her voice carrying over the whistling wind. "The spirits demand we return to tradition." Lanterns lined the creek's edge, their flames dancing precariously in the biting gusts. Children huddled against their parents, wide-eyed and uncertain. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, their faces taut with anxiety as they awaited Margaret's guidance. From the edge of the gathering, Emily Johnson watched the scene unfold. The girl who had once been bound and left for dead now stood tall, her thin frame wrapped in a woolen cloak. Months of healing under Michael's care had transformed her from a trembling victim into someone with purpose. She took a deep breath, her fingers clutching the carved talisman hidden in her pocket. "I cannot let this continue," she whispered to herself. With unexpected boldness, Emily stepped forward through the crowd. Villagers parted, murmuring in surprise as she approached Margaret. The elder's expression hardened, but before she could speak, Emily's clear voice rang out across the gathering. "We don't need to fear the mountains or the birds that soar above them," she proclaimed, her words steady despite her racing heart. "The vultures aren't harbingers of doom. They're guardians of these lands, cleaning what would otherwise bring disease." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Anna Davis, standing nearby, nodded almost imperceptibly, encouraging the girl to continue. "I invite you all to join me in a new ceremony," Emily continued, extending her hands. "One that honors life instead of sacrifice. One that welcomes the natural order without twisting it into something fearful." She lifted her lantern higher, its light catching the silhouettes of vultures circling overhead. "These birds didn't come for me when I was bound on that ridge. They came because that's their purpose, to transform death into renewal." Margaret stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "You dare challenge centuries of wisdom?" But Emily didn't falter. She turned away from the elder and began walking along the creek, her lantern held high. "Follow me if you wish to break the chain of fear that has bound this village for too long." For a moment, no one moved. Then Anna stepped forward, her healing hands clutching her own lantern. One by one, others joined. First the children, then their hesitant parents, forming a new procession that followed Emily away from the ridge and toward a future unbound by superstition. A profound silence fell over the gathered villagers as Emily Johnson stepped forward, her small figure illuminated by the glow of dozens of lanterns. The vultures that had once been symbols of death now circled overhead in a mesmerizing dance against the night sky. With quiet determination, she led the procession away from the ridge, that place of ancient sacrifice, and transformed what had been a ritual of fear into one of collective hope. "Follow me," she called, her voice stronger than anyone remembered. "These birds aren't harbingers of doom. They're guardians, watching over us." The lantern flames flickered in the winter breeze, casting golden light across the snow-covered ground and reflecting off dark feathers as several vultures swooped lower, seemingly curious about this unusual human gathering. Children pointed upward in wonder rather than terror, their faces alight with newfound fascination. Elder Margaret Brown stood rigid at the edge of the crowd, her weathered face a mask of disbelief as her authority visibly crumbled. For decades, she had wielded the old traditions like weapons, keeping the village in line through carefully cultivated fear. Now, watching Emily lead her people in this reimagined ceremony, the elder's hands trembled around her ceremonial staff. "This is sacrilege," Margaret hissed, but fewer villagers heeded her words than ever before. Anna Davis, who had spent years mixing healing herbs while keeping her doubts silent, finally found her courage. The healer stepped away from Margaret's shadow and moved to Emily's side. "I've watched our children sicken from fear," Anna announced, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "I've treated wounds of the body, but Emily is healing wounds of our spirit." The villagers exchanged uncertain glances. Some nodded in agreement, while others clung to Margaret's side, unwilling to abandon generations of belief. The division was palpable, like a crack spreading through ice, as Hollow Creek began to split between those embracing change and those fearing it. Michael Smith watched from the perimeter, his tall frame half hidden in shadow. A smile touched his lips as he witnessed Emily's transformation from victim to leader. The mountain man caught her eye briefly, giving a single nod of approval that meant more to her than any grand gesture. As the procession wound its way back toward the village center, the lanterns created a river of light against the darkness. For the first time in living memory, the people of Hollow Creek began to see themselves not as helpless pawns of ancient superstition, but as authors of their own story, capable of rewriting traditions that no longer served them. The vultures continued their silent circling overhead, witnesses to the night when fear began to lose its grip on Hollow Creek. Children's laughter echoed across the village square as they chased Emily Johnson through fresh snow. No longer hiding their friendship, they played openly with the girl who had once been bound on the ridge. Their parents watched from doorways, some with lingering unease, others with quiet acceptance of the change sweeping through Hollow Creek. Even Margaret Brown, despite her rigid stance, could not ignore the transformation. The village that had once cowered under the weight of ancient superstition now breathed easier. Fields lay dormant under winter's blanket, yet there was a sense of peace rather than dread about the coming season. The vultures still circled high above the mountains, but villagers no longer saw them as harbingers of doom. Instead, they had become simply birds riding the wind currents, neither good nor evil. In his cabin, Michael Smith stoked the fire, his weathered hands moving mechanically while his thoughts wandered. The physical scars from the rock slide had begun to heal, leaving ridged patterns across his shoulder and back. But the invisible wounds cut deeper. Faces that once greeted him warmly now turned away when he approached the trading post. Conversations halted when he entered the healer's hut for supplies. "You've changed things," Anna Davis told him during one such visit, her voice low as she wrapped herbs in cloth. "Not everyone is ready for change." The mountain man nodded, understanding the price of defiance. Robert had spread tales that the winter would be harsh because of Michael's actions, though the blacksmith's influence had waned since their confrontation. That evening, as snowflakes drifted past his window, Emily sat across from him, carving patterns into a piece of wood with the same knife that had cut her bonds. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly, looking up with eyes that had grown wiser beyond their years. Michael considered the question, remembering the family gatherings he would never again be welcome at, the traditions he had been raised to honor. Then he thought of the girl before him, alive and strong, no longer trembling at every shadow. "No," he answered simply. "True honor isn't found in following rules that harm the innocent." Emily nodded, understanding the weight of his sacrifice. Outside, the wind carried voices of children singing winter songs, no longer including verses about appeasing angry spirits. Michael smiled faintly. He might stand apart from the village now, but he stood on the right side of conscience. And that, he knew, was worth every scar. The last of the snow retreated from the valley as spring warmth coaxed new life from the soil. Hollow Creek stirred with anticipation as villagers gathered in the council hall, their faces a mixture of uncertainty and hope. The old wooden benches creaked under their weight, while sunlight streamed through open doors, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Emily Johnson stood at the center, her slight frame no longer trembling with fear, but standing tall. The months with Michael had transformed her from a sacrificial victim into someone who commanded attention without demanding it. Her eyes, once hollow with terror, now held the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death and walked away. "We've followed the rite of atonement for generations," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "But what has it brought us except more fear?" Margaret Brown rose from her seat. Her authority diminished but not entirely gone. "The old ways protected us," she insisted, though her voice lacked its former conviction. Anna Davis stepped forward, the healer's hands steady as she placed a small loaf of bread on the floor. "I offer this instead of blood," she announced. "Life should sustain life, not end it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Then Thomas, who had once schemed to profit from Emily's story, approached with a handful of grain. His gesture, born perhaps more from pragmatism than conviction, nonetheless broke the dam of hesitation. One by one, villagers came forward, farmers with seeds, mothers with bread, children with wildflowers. Each offering represented a conscious choice to turn away from the darkness of tradition towards something kinder. From his position near the back wall, Michael Smith watched in silence. The mountain man's weathered face revealed little, but those who knew him best could see the complex emotions in his eyes. Pride in Emily's courage warred with sorrow for all the years and lives lost to fear. His own mother had once stood against these same customs, and he wondered what she would think of this moment. Robert Martin was among the last to approach. The blacksmith's reluctance was evident in his stiff gait, but even he placed a token of grain beside the others. His eyes briefly met Michael's, not in challenge this time, but in grudging acknowledgement. As the ceremony concluded, Emily found her way to Michael's side. "They're changing," she whispered. He nodded, his calloused hand briefly touching her shoulder. "Because of you." "Because of us," she corrected. Outside, the fields of Hollow Creek awaited planting. The earth ready for new beginnings. The village that had once bound a girl for Vultures now bound itself to a different future. One where mercy outweighed sacrifice and courage overcame fear. Spring blossomed over Hollow Creek, painting the once barren ridge with wildflowers. Emily Johnson, who had trembled beneath circling vultures just a year before, now strode confidently through meadows where children followed in her wake. Her transformation was more profound than anyone could have imagined. The girl who had been bound as a sacrifice now embodied the village's newfound courage. "Tell us about the vultures again," pleaded a small boy, tugging at her sleeve as they gathered berries along the creek's edge. Emily smiled, the shadows in her eyes replaced by a gentle wisdom beyond her years. "They aren't harbingers of death," she explained, pointing skyward where the great birds soared on thermal currents. "They're guardians of the land, cleaning what others leave behind." The children nodded solemnly, no longer taught to fear the birds or the ancient stories that had once ruled their lives. Where terror had reigned, Emily had sown understanding. Her laughter, once silenced by tradition, now rang through the village like a healing bell. In the marketplace, Anna Davis watched with quiet satisfaction. The healer had finally found her voice, speaking openly against the old ways and teaching younger women to question rather than simply obey. She caught Emily's eye across the square and raised her hand in greeting, their shared courage a bridge between generations. Meanwhile, Michael Smith continued his solitary existence in the mountain cabin. Though not as alone as before, villagers who had once shunned him now left offerings of bread and preserves at his door. Children brought him drawings of his daring rescue, and even Robert reluctantly acknowledged his strength with a nod when their paths crossed during hunting season. The mountain man, they called him in hushed, reverent tones. Not an outcast anymore, but a legend. The man who had defied centuries of tradition to save one girl, and in doing so, saved them all from their own fear. Thomas Lopez, passing through on his seasonal trading route, found his sensational tales of the vulture girl met with stern correction rather than eager ears. The village protected its own story now, refusing to let it become mere entertainment for outsiders. Even Margaret Brown had softened somewhat, though she maintained her distance from both Emily and Michael. The elder sat longer in silence these days, watching the changing village with eyes that held more questions than certainty. On clear evenings, Emily would climb to the ridge, not in fear, but in remembrance. From there, she could see Michael's cabin, smoke curling from its chimney, a reminder that courage often begins with a single act of compassion. She had been a victim. Now she was a beacon, her very existence a testament to what happens when someone refuses to accept that cruelty is simply the way things have always been. As the first snow of winter melted into spring's gentle thaw, Hollow Creek stood transformed. The village that had once cowered beneath the weight of ancient fear now bustled with renewed purpose. Children played freely in the meadows where vultures still circled, no longer omens of doom, but guardians of a new beginning. Emily Johnson walked among the villagers with quiet confidence, her once frail frame now strong from months of hunting and riding. When she spoke, people listened, not out of fear or pity, but with genuine respect. The girl who had been bound for sacrifice had become the village's most powerful voice for change. Michael Smith remained on the outskirts, as was his nature. The mountain man's cabin had become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking wisdom or courage, though he received visitors with the same gruff kindness that had saved Emily's life. The scars on his body told stories of that fateful night and the struggles that followed, each one a badge of honor in the eyes of those who now understood his sacrifice. Margaret Brown had retreated into a dignified silence. The elder still attended council meetings, but her voice carried less weight now that the village had seen another path forward. Some said she had begun to question her own devotion to traditions that demanded such terrible costs. Anna Davis flourished in her role as healer, no longer constrained by fear. She taught young apprentices the properties of mountain herbs, often working alongside Emily to develop new remedies. Their friendship had become a symbol of the village's healing. Even Robert Martin had found a measure of peace. The blacksmith's forge rang with the same strength as always, but his hammers now shaped tools for building rather than weapons for confrontation. He nodded respectfully when Michael passed, a silent acknowledgement between men who had learned to value different kinds of strength. During the harvest festival, Thomas Lopez returned with his wagons of trade goods. The trader watched with surprise as Emily led the ceremonies, his schemes forgotten as he witnessed the profound change in the community he had once sought to exploit. Around evening fires, parents told their children the story that had reshaped their world. How vultures had gathered above a ridge, how a lone rider had charged through darkness, and how courage had prevailed against the crushing weight of tradition. The tale grew with each telling, polished like a river stone until it gleamed with truth beyond mere facts. Hollow Creek had written a new chapter in its history. One act of defiance had rippled outward, touching every life and altering the very soul of the community. The village now understood that true strength lay not in blind obedience to the past, but in the courage to forge a more compassionate future.